Welcome to ACP. I'm your host, Alex Bollfrass, the head of strategy, technology, and arms control at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Berlin. On each episode, we welcome the world's leading experts in arms control to share their knowledge and assessments of the most critical issues. Whether you're new to the topic or need a refresher, I hope you will join us in our exploration of everything related to arms control. In this season, we offer primers on all the nuclear weapons arsenals currently existing in the world and their relationship to arms control. I hope it helps you better know a nuke.
The Soviet leadership recognized that there was a strategic balance between the two superpowers. There was a certain mutual deterrence, which the Soviets also accepted, and that this balance was basically stable, but also that they accepted that strategic arms limitations could contribute to the balance.
It never ends with you building things and the opponent just saying, oh, that's how it goes. There'll be always the action-reaction cycle, which in the absence of any arms control limitations, pushes everybody to just build new systems and build more and try to create defenses against new systems, which then can trigger necessity for even more offensive systems.
In this episode, we tackled the history and evolution of Russia's nuclear arsenal, from its Soviet origins to its current modernization efforts. We'll explore the role of arms control agreements, how they shaped the nuclear balance, where they succeeded, and where they fell apart. Our guests, Lydia Wachs and Andrey Baklitskiy, will guide us through critical moments, including the Soviet nuclear buildup, Cold War arms racing, and the treaties that sought to curb escalation. Finally, we'll examine the impact of recent geopolitical tensions, the war in Ukraine, and the future of nuclear diplomacy between the United States and the Russian Federation.
My name is Lydia Wachs, and I'm a PhD candidate in international relations at Stockholm University, where I work on Soviet and Russian nuclear non-proliferation policies. So this is the topic of my dissertation, but more broadly, I work on all things Russian nuclear strategy. Already in the 1920s to some extent, but then especially in the 1930s, did Soviet physicists really engage in atomic research. And this went hand in hand generally with this political strife in the Soviet Union under Stalin to catch up with and overtake the capitalist technological progress. This, in a way, spurred this research, but at the same time, politics also curtailed science and its physics in the Soviet Union under Stalin. Especially during the 1930s, there was a lot of pressure on scientists to show loyalty with the party and the state and the ideology, which made things rather difficult. And then there were several efforts towards this nuclear weapons program. After Soviet physicists found out about nuclear fission in the late 1930s, they only alerted in 1940 the political leaders in Moscow to the discovery of fission and its military significance. And this then led to a commission that was set up on the so-called uranium problem. But this commission, although it was the first real effort, remained rather ineffective, and especially the German invasion of the Soviet Union really hampered further nuclear research. So it took until 1942-43 for Stalin to restart a research project on nuclear weapons. He ordered a new project and a new lab led by the famous Soviet physicist Igor Kurchatov. But also this project again remained rather small, and it seems that Stalin did not really think that nuclear weapons could be developed in time to affect the war outcome. The Soviets had received intelligence on the US Manhattan Project, so the development of nuclear weapons in the US already in previous years. But then at the Potsdam Conference in 1945, Truman notified Stalin of their program, although he kept it rather vague. And this slowly set into motion a process in the Soviet Union, which then really got underway with the US bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, because then the Soviet leadership really got convinced that nuclear weapons would play a strategic role, and Stalin especially got very concerned about the balance of power that could change with such a new potent capability, and he was afraid that basically the US would now be able to shape the post-war settlement and European order. Following this, Stalin then ordered a crash program to develop a Soviet atomic bomb as soon as possible and installed Lavrentiy Beria, the chief of the NKVD, the forerunner of the KGB, as the head of this, as well as Igor Kurchatov, this famous physicist, as the scientific director. Now suddenly really all resources were mobilized in the Soviet Union to develop nuclear weapons, which also meant that the Soviets made heavy use of prisoners from the Gulag system in the Soviet Union. The Soviets made heavy use of intelligence about Western nuclear research, and probably only this allowed the Soviet Union to develop nuclear weapons so quickly. The first Soviet nuclear weapons test took place on August 2nd, 1949 at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. Then the Soviet Union emerged as the second nuclear weapons state.
My name is Andrey Baklitskiy. I'm a senior researcher at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. My main thing I do at the UN is nuclear risk reduction, but for more than a decade, I've been working on nuclear issues from all possible perspectives, and a lot of this was bilateral arms control between US and Russia, US and Soviet Union. In 1957, Soviet Union tested the first ICBM, which then was used as a rocket to launch first artificial satellite in orbit. Soviet Union was quite successful in developing cruise missiles at the beginning. Cruise missiles, which are basically unmanned planes, were considered as an option for delivering nuclear weapons. Soviet Union was experimenting with higher yields. So in 1961, the Tsar Bomba, the most powerful nuclear bomb ever detonated, 50 megatons, was tested. Obviously, ballistic missile submarines and cylinder ballistic missiles. But for a while, despite those efforts, Soviet Union was lagging behind the United States in pure numbers, in numbers of missiles, in numbers of warheads. Of course, from time to time, the United States got it wrong, and things like missile gap, things like bomber gap were coming online when the United States believed that Soviet Union actually had more stuff than it actually had. And that is how you have a nuclear arms race. Soviet Union actually only caught up with the United States in terms of numbers around 1980s. And then it overtook the United States, and the peak was in 1986 with 40,000 nuclear warheads. And then they slowly started going down from there. The Soviet Union was an early adapter and early investor in missile defense, strategic missile defense. In 1961, the first successful test of ABM system in Soviet Union happened when they hit an IRBM with an anti-missile. At that time, it wasn't even clear if you can technically do it because the speeds are so high that it's not a given that was possible. I showed you that the Soviet Union was a pretty fast learner, and in some of the fields, even going ahead of the United States. But then they got their off parity, and that's what got us to arms control. It's almost a given that once we talk about Soviet Union, US arms control, we're talking about Cuban Missile Crisis. The technical feats of Soviet Union were not really influencing their dynamics, but also the United States numbers superiority also didn't help the United States really during the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy was writing in his diary after the fact that he was super surprised that it wasn't playing a role because the United States had so much more nuclear weapons. It didn't matter. Once Soviet Union had ability to strike the United States, once it put missiles on Cuba, who cares how much more you have if you can still be nuked? So with the crisis and with the not seeing that superiority is giving you that much, there was a push in Soviet Union and United States to try to discuss some of the limitations. And the first limitations were basically not directly connected to the main stuff.
The first nuclear arms control agreements emerged in the early 1970s. But for this to become possible, it's important to think about the change of mindset in the Soviet Union, because under Stalin, there was this Leninist idea that war between the systems would be inevitable. This mindset changed under Khrushchev, who adopted this idea of peaceful coexistence, which meant that actually the two systems could exist at the same time, which also then allowed at a later stage for cooperation. And In the 1960s, the Soviet Union then gained, for the first time really, a second strike capability. Looking at Soviet military writings from this time, the Soviet leadership recognized that there was a strategic balance between the two superpowers. There was a certain mutual deterrence, which the Soviets also accepted, and that this balance was basically stable, but also that they accepted that strategic arms limitations could contribute to the balance. With this perspective, arms control became possible between the Cold War enemies. And then the first arms control agreement emerged in the early 1970s. It was basically triggered by a US proposal in the late 1960s to hold bilateral strategic arms limitation talks and also to avoid an arms race in ballistic missile defense systems. The US made this proposal, which then led to talks between the two sides, which eventually caused the first formal arms control agreements, which were, first of all, the SALT I, or Interim Agreement of Offensive Arms, which imposed a freeze on the number of launchers for ICBMs and FLBMs. At that time, the Soviet Union had about 1,600 ICBMs, and the US had about only 1,000 ICBMs, so which made it actually rather controversial in the US. But there was also a second agreement, which was the ABM Treaty, which put a cap on ballistic missile defense. So it permitted the US and the Soviet Union to deploy ABM interceptors only at two sites. One could be centered around the capital and the second one around an ICBM field. And each site was only allowed to have 100 launchers for ABM interceptor missiles. And this was then later in 1974 with a protocol reduced to only one ABM site in each country. So these two agreements formalize a link for the first time between offensive and defensive weapons, which has played an important role since then and still does, I think, if we look at current politics. Despite the conclusion of SALT I, the Soviet Union still felt it had to continue military efforts to keep up the balance with the United States, and also the US further built up their nuclear arsenals. This first arms control agreements did play an important role and set an important precedent, but it did not really change the arms competition. Following SALT I, the US and the Soviet Union engaged in a second round of negotiations on further limits, which in the end led to the so-called SALT II agreement, which was signed by the two sides in 1979. It limited each side to a total of 2,400 strategic delivery vehicles, meaning ICBMs, SLBMs, and heavy bombers, which were then later also to decline to 2,250. Plus, there were also certain sub-limits, and there was also a limit on actually missile modernization programs, so certain qualitative limits. Critics in the US noted that the Soviets would have an advantage due to their large ICBM force with MIRVs, so basically ICBMs with multiple warheads. But also the political situation in the late 70s was not conducive to arms control. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, which caused Jimmy Carter, then US president, to decide to withdraw the treaty from Senate consideration. So it was never ratified. But what is remarkable was that both sides still honor the terms of the agreement. After the SALT process, the Reagan administration in the 1980s wanted to continue basically cuts in nuclear arms. Reagan decided to propose quite deep reductions of 50% to the Soviet Union, believing that the Soviets would reject this from the beginning so that the US could basically blame Moscow for this stagnating arms control. But actually, once Gorbachev took power in Moscow and the Soviet Union's economic problems got worse and worse, Moscow got much more interested in such a proposal. A challenge that emerged during those talks was, however, US interest in strategic missile defense. Moscow wanted Washington to hold its missile defense research, which Washington was not really willing to do. It took until the Bush administration in the early 1990s, when Cold War tensions dwindled, for the two sides to conclude and sign the START treaty. Although both sides were able to conclude the treaty in 1991, Another problem soon emerged, which was that the Soviet Union fell apart, and suddenly there were a lot of Soviet successor states which hosted Soviet nuclear weapons. Before the treaty could even enter into force, these countries also had to become parties to the START treaty, which was not an easy process because not all republics were willing to basically just like that hand those weapons back to Moscow, which took until 1995 for the treaty to enter into force. And what is remarkable about START is that it included for the first time real reductions in strategic nuclear weapons. It put a cap of 1,600 deployed ICBMs, SLBMs, and heavy bombers, and a cap of 6,000 nuclear warheads attributed to deployed ICBMs, SLBMs, and heavy bombers. It also included verification measures, so data exchanges and inspections, which were very important in making those cuts even possible. A very interesting arms control arrangement that emerged during the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War are the so-called presidential nuclear initiatives, or just PNIs. Those were a series of unilateral commitments announced by the United States and the Soviet Union, and then later Russia in 1991 and 1992, that led to substantial reductions in both strategic forces, but especially also non-strategic nuclear forces. The PNIs were triggered by Washington's concerns about the political instability and control of the Soviet nuclear arsenal when the Soviet Union fell apart. Here it's important to note that only 80% of the Soviet nuclear arsenal was located in Russia, but 20% were in now former and independent republics. This caused President Bush Sr. to announce unilateral reductions and related measures affecting both strategic as well as non-strategic nuclear weapons, and he also called on Gorbachev to reciprocate these measures. This was quite successful. It led to 2 rounds of such commitments in 1991 and 92, which led to force reductions, but especially also transparency measures. Furthermore, what makes the PNIs rather unique is that they were not legally binding, and they also did not include any monitoring mechanisms or no clear time frame for implementation. It's, of course, interesting to think about what the Russian interest really was in those PNIs. I'd say that the security and economic situation really played into Moscow's rationale to reciprocate these PNIs. Moscow wanted to get control over its nuclear forces that were located in former Soviet republics, and the PNIs basically helped Russia to get control over these nuclear forces. There was also the desolate economic situation, which required Moscow to cut back its forces. Beyond these material interests, there was also this great interest in both under Gorbachev and then Yeltsin to work together with the United States and to project this new image of Russia as a partner of the West, and thereby also signaling Russia's status.
The 90s can be seen as a direct continuation of the arms control process, which started at the very end of the 80s. There was this feeling that Cold War is over, and now our main preoccupation is not how to prepare to fight a nuclear war with each other, or not even keeping the things we have. It was basically how to manage those arsenals which we inherited. We don't need them that much, and make sure that we can do it cost effectively and safely. On the Russian side, there was always concern that Russia would still need to preserve their nuclear forces and have this deterrent effect because Russian conventional military was weakened significantly, but still the idea that we will need to get some peace dividend was quite strong. START 1, huge cuts. It was like 6,000 warheads, deployed warheads. START 2, which was negotiated in parallel, signed in 93, another huge cut to 3,000, 3,500 warheads. So again, in the 80s, we were talking tens of thousands on both sides, like 40,000 in Soviet Union, 30 plus something in the United States. Now we're talking 3,000 deployed with START 2. And the idea of START 2 was also cutting all the multiple reentry vehicles, ICBMs with multiple warheads. Because again, one of the ideas on the western side was that those are destabilizing because They are more useful for attacks than for defense. In case of crisis, if you hit one on the ground, the enemy will lose like 10 warheads instead of one. So that gives you some incentives. Again, Russia was not so sure about this because Russian response was basically, even if you launch one, then it's 10 warheads in the air. So that's even better for if you're defending. But anyhow, that came to be an agreement. Again, never enter into force, fortunately, or fortunately, some people would say, on the Russian side, because of the treaty complications later on. And then after START 2 was signed, they start talking about the next follow-up agreement, planned START 3. It was never finalized, and when START 2 collapsed, it wasn't picked up. And the START 2 collapsed because it was linked to ABM treaty, the missile defense. And by the end of the 90s, there was again a resurgence of talks about missile defense in the United States. And once it came from President Clinton to President Bush, and then 9/11 happened, there was understanding that the United States would not stick to ABM treaty. The United States wanted to build its national missile defense system. START 2 never entered into force in 2002 after US withdrew from ABM, Russia withdrew from START 2.
Both sides were able to conclude a much lighter and very different agreement in the early 2000s. The name of that agreement was the Strategic Offensive Reductions Treaty, or just SWORD. There have also been jokes around this treaty that it's just a treaty. And those jokes do have some basis, because what is interesting about the agreement is that it's extremely vague and has basically only one major provision. So it limits the aggregate numbers of both parties to strategic nuclear warheads to 1,700 to 2,200 for each party, but it does not include any definition of strategic nuclear warheads, and it also does not include any counting rules, supplements, or verification provisions, and it only relies basically on the first START treaty for verification. So this is a very vague treaty, and it has been shaped a lot by basically the two persons that were in power then. Bush Jr. sort of was negotiated under Putin and Bush Jr., but Bush was really not interested at all in binding arms control. He wanted non-binding commitments without any specific provisions or verification mechanisms. Putin actually rather rejected this and wanted instead legally binding and a verifiable treaty, because the situation for Russia in the early 2000s was rather bad in terms of economic potential. So Russia was quite interested in having a cap on the US technological progress. Bush agreed in the end to a legally binding format, but the treaty itself remained that vague. New START emerged under the Obama administration and Medvedev as Russian president. Around 2008, both parties start talks on a START follow-on agreement, which was supposed to expire in 2009. But both parties, although they wanted to conclude an agreement before a START would expire, were not able to conclude an agreement in time. It took them until 2010 to sign New START, which then entered into force in 2011. New START defines basically the deepest cuts so far in strategic arms. It caps both parties' arsenals to 1,550 deployed warheads on strategic delivery vehicles. It's much more flexible in START because it does not include any sublimits, but basically both sides can structure their forces as they wish. Furthermore, there is the cap of 800 deployed and non-deployed ICBMs, SLBM launchers, and deployed and non-deployed heavy bombers, and within this total, there's basically another limit of more than 700 deployed strategic delivery vehicles for both sides. And beyond these provisions or cuts, it also has a rather intrusive verification regime. New START foresees data exchanges, inspections, and missile launch notifications. But the situation around New START started to deteriorate basically already during the pandemic. The pandemic did not allow for inspections to take place anymore. So at least from 2020 onwards, there were no inspections. Just before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there was some hope that there could perhaps be a New START follow-on agreement, because New START expires in 2026. And there were a few meetings in 2021 and early 2022 of the US and Russian delegations in the framework of the US-Russian strategic stability dialogue. But as we all know, Russia then decided to invade Ukraine in February 2022. And in February 2023, Putin announced Russia's suspension of its participation in New START, something that is actually not foreseen by the treaty. So it's not legal, this step. So Russia has now announced that it will observe the treaty limits, but it will not conduct any on-site inspections, and it will also not exchange data. What Russia still wants to do is to continue the exchange of missile launch notifications in the framework of another agreement, which is the 1998 Ballistic Missile Launch Notification Agreement.
There are two parts of the modernization program. One is what you can call like 100% pure modernization, which is just substituting your missiles for newer missiles. And has been going for a while now. With the Bulava ICBM, the new one for the Navy, and then moving from Topol to Topol-M to YARS in the strategic missile forces, both for road mobile and the silo-based missiles. And then the big thing open-ended is the heavy ICBMs, so Voyvoda missiles, changing them to a Sarmat missile. And that has been going for a while. There is a mixed record of testing of Sarmat, and that's quite important because heavy ICBMs always was a big part of Russian strategic missile forces. But this is a modernization progress when you just switch to missiles. The other part was influenced by the United States withdrawing from INF Treaty. And after this withdrawal, Russia basically said, we will need to make sure we can defeat any missile defense you can put up. So our return would stay the same. We have the secure second strike capability. There was a bunch of programs. Some of them were new. Some of them were basically resurrected Soviet programs from the 80s. And Soviet Union had the same problem with countering US strategic defense initiative. And as a part of this program, a number of systems were announced. So as I already mentioned, Sarmat, it's a heavy ICBM. So basically that would have happened anyway. But then there was a nuclear-powered cruise missile, Prevestnik, announced as a planned system. Boost glide vehicle, Avangard, which is launched by an ICBM. Probably the Sarmat wants it out there. Now I think it's some of the smaller missile, which is launched by a missile and then flying on a non-ballistic trajectory and evade missile defenses. And then Poseidon, the quote-unquote intercontinental autonomous torpedo, nuclear torpedo. So there was a bunch of those systems, and they all were aimed at defeating missile defenses, or potential US missile defenses, which again, some can say is excessive because US missile defenses is what 40-something interceptors at the moment, and their success rate is not really high. And actually, the whole program is in limbo for a while. And the US is trying to make a new interceptor. And we'll see how that goes, especially with Trump plans for Iron Dome for America. I would say that even the existing Russian arsenal could have penetrated this quite easily. But now we have a number of those new systems, which are, again, all at different stages of development. So Avangard is presumably on duty. It was even exhibited to the Americans as a part of New START inspections when those were still happening. Sarmat is undergoing testing, some more successful than others, probably will be finalized at some point and put on duty. It's not clear how the cruise missile is going. We heard from the Western sources that there was an explosion attributed to explosion in NOx when there was a spike on radiation from that place. So some people speculated that maybe it would kill the program. It still continues after that. And then the Poseidon torpedo is also being developed. All of those systems are, especially the torpedo and the cruise missiles, they're not really good for the first strike. They're slow. It's not how you conduct the first strike. People can argue that maybe it's better for strategic stability to have those systems because they're very hard to defend against. But then, of course, as we know in history, it never ends with you building things and the opponent just saying, oh, that's how it goes. There'll be always action-reaction cycle, which in the absence of any arms control limitations pushes everybody to just build new systems and build more and try to create defenses against new systems, which then can, trigger necessity for even more offensive systems. So that's where we are now. According to General Karakayev, who's the head of Russian strategic missile forces, the Russian strategic missile forces have been modernized by 80%. So 80% are the modern systems. We cannot really confirm that, especially with some of the newer systems, but that's a huge contrast with the United States when Advance 3, which is the backbone of the ground part of Triad, has been there since like 70s or 80s. There have been modernization, but this is the same basic missile. In that sense, Russia is ahead of the United States in modernization cycle.
There are mainly two challenges for the future of arms control. The first one is, of course, there is no political will in Moscow right now to engage in talks, although arms control could actually be rather beneficial for Russia also in the current situation, because Russia will have to, or is already trying to reconstitute its conventional forces, which is quite expensive. And its economic pressures will also increase over the next years. Russia will have a lot of incentives for arms control, but there is no political will right now. And with the Trump administration, it is also very difficult to predict whether arms control could be possible. There's also a second challenge, and this is the deep disagreements on what a future treaty should actually include. So the United States has been interested in covering in a new agreement not only basically the current strategic nuclear forces, but also new strategic delivery vehicles that Russia has developed, as well as non-strategic nuclear weapons, because Russia has a huge force of non-strategic nuclear weapons, something that the United States does not have. And the US has been interested in capping those for quite some time now. But Russia has rejected any caps on non-strategic nuclear forces and also has a broader agenda when it comes to arms control. So it is interested in capping not only nuclear, but also non-nuclear strategic forces, as well as offensive and defensive weapons. Missile defense is one element that Russia would want to see in arms control agreement. And now with Trump's missile defense ideas, it doesn't seem like arms control is very likely anytime soon.
There is this approach to the arms control which equates it with disarmament and then labels it as just weak or not something you do if you're strong, America first or Russia first or China first or what have you. I don't think that's a right approach. President Nixon did nuclear arms control. President Reagan did nuclear arms control. Secretary General Brezhnev did arms control. China's leaders, arms control is a tool to provide your national security. Some things are much better to do with diplomacy than with open-handed nuclear arms race, where you cannot really know where this whole thing ends. And then once you start the process, it's really hard to stop it because there is like all sorts of incentives to continue it and imperfect information and the fear that the other side would overtake you. It would be much cheaper, much safer, and much more beneficial for everybody to just agree to some rules of the road. And arms control can help with that and has a lot of tools in the toolbox which have been tried and tested and pretty much worked during the period of their implementation. It's not fancy to talk about arms control these days, but I would suggest the people who think it's weakness and is useless, why would those leaders in the past do it if it was such a terrible idea?
Thank you for listening, and to our guests and the European Union's Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium for funding the series. Until next time, stay optimistic.